What happens when the person you trust the most, the person you welcome into your home, is secretly a monster? In today's story, we delve into a case that is as heartbreaking as it is horrifying. A crime so brutal and calculated, it left seasoned investigators speechless. A young man, a seemingly ordinary cafe worker, who charmed his way into a loving family, only to systematically destroy it. This is a story of love, betrayal, and a darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of everyday life. Before we unravel the chilling details of this shocking crime, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you don't miss our deep dives into the cases that leave you questioning everything. Now let's begin. The morning of October 28, 2023, broke crisp and clear over the idyllic suburban town of Oakhaven, a place that prided itself on its manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and the comforting illusion of safety. But on Maple Avenue, a street lined with mature oak trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn fiery shades of orange and red, that illusion was about to be shattered. The silence that had settled over number 12, the home of the Harrison family, was not the peaceful slumber of a Saturday morning, but a heavy, unnatural quiet that seemed to absorb all sound. It was just after 9 a.m. when Carol, the Harrisons' next-door neighbor for the better part of 2 decades, felt the first prickle of unease. A retired schoolteacher with a penchant for early morning gardening, Carol was accustomed to the rhythms of her neighbors' lives. On a Saturday, the Harrison household was usually a hive of activity. Richard, a jovial man in his late 50s, would be out by now, meticulously washing his prized vintage Ford Mustang, the sound of the radio and his off-key humming a familiar weekend soundtrack. His wife, Eleanor, a woman whose kindness was as legendary as her award-winning rose bushes, would be in her garden, her laughter carrying over the picket fence as she chatted with passers-by. Their 2 children, 22-year-old Sarah and 19-year-old Ben, would often be seen coming and going, their youthful energy a vibrant counterpoint to the quiet tranquility of the street. But this morning there was nothing. The Mustang sat under its cover in the driveway, and the windows of the 2-story colonial home remained dark. Eleanor's gardening tools lay neatly by the side of the house, untouched. Carol's calls to the house phone went unanswered, as did her texts to Eleanor's cell. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. It wasn't like the Harrisons to be so quiet, so unresponsive. Her concern growing with each passing minute, Carol walked over and rang the doorbell. The cheerful chime echoed inside, followed by an unnerving silence. She peered through the frosted glass of the front door, but could see nothing. Hesitantly, she tried the doorknob and found it unlocked, a detail that sent a fresh wave of alarm through her. The Harrisons were meticulous about locking their doors. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open a few inches and called out, "Eleanor? Richard? Is everything all right?" Her voice sounded small and tinny in the stillness. The only response was the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Taking another tentative step inside, she was immediately hit by a smell. It was a strange, coppery odor, thick and cloying, that clung to the air. It was a smell she instinctively recognized, though she couldn't immediately place it. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the foyer, she saw it. A dark stain on the pristine white runner that stretched down the hallway. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely dial 911. "There's something wrong at my neighbor's house," she stammered to the dispatcher, her voice cracking with fear. "The Harrisons, 12 Maple Avenue." The door was unlocked. "There's a strange smell." The first patrol car arrived in under 3 minutes, its siren a jarring intrusion into the morning's quietude. The 2 officers, their faces grim and professional, entered the house with their hands on their holsters. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The scene was one of unimaginable carnage. Richard and Eleanor Harrison were found in the living room, their bodies bearing the marks of a brutal and frenzied attack. Upstairs, the horror continued. Ben was in his bedroom, seemingly attacked in his sleep, while Sarah was found in the hallway, her life extinguished in a desperate attempt to flee. The house, a place that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, had been transformed into a tomb. The silence that had so unsettled Carol was the silence of death, a profound and absolute stillness that spoke of a life violently and senselessly extinguished. By the time Detective Miles Corbin arrived, the house was a flurry of controlled chaos. The street was cordoned off with yellow police tape, and a small crowd of concerned neighbors had gathered, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Corbin, a man whose weary eyes had seen more than his fair share of human depravity, felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest as he ducked under the tape and made his way to the front door. Inside, the forensic team was already at work, their movements precise and methodical as they documented the scene. Corbin was briefed by the first responding officers, their voices low and strained. The brutality of the crime was immediately apparent. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a targeted act of violence, fueled by a rage that was both terrifying and deeply personal. As he walked through the house, taking in the gruesome tableau, Corbin's attention was drawn to the small details that would become the building blocks of his investigation. There were no signs of forced entry, which suggested that the killer had either been let in by the victims or had a key. The house had not been ransacked. Wallets and purses lay untouched, and expensive electronics were still in their place. This was about something other than material gain. In the living room, a family portrait hung above the fireplace, a poignant reminder of the lives that had been so brutally cut short. The Harrisons smiled out from the frame, their eyes full of life and happiness. It was a portrait of a perfect family, a family that seemed to have it all. Now, they were a statistic, the victims of a crime that defied comprehension. Corbin's focus narrowed as he began to piece together a timeline of the victims' last hours. Neighbors reported hearing nothing out of the ordinary the previous night. The last confirmed sighting of any of the family members was on Friday evening when Eleanor and Richard had returned from their weekly dinner out. Sarah had been at her part-time job at a local bookstore, and Ben had been at a friend's house studying for a midterm exam. The investigation quickly turned to those closest to the family, as is standard in such cases. Friends, colleagues, and extended family members were interviewed, all expressing a mixture of grief and disbelief. The Harrisons were universally described as a kind, loving, and well-respected family. They had no known enemies, no dark secrets that anyone was aware of. It was during these initial interviews that a name began to surface, a name that would soon become the focal point of the entire investigation. Lucas Thorne. Lucas was Sarah's boyfriend, a handsome and charismatic 24-year-old who worked as a barista at a trendy downtown cafe. They had been dating for just over a year, and by all accounts, their relationship was serious. Lucas was a frequent visitor to the Harrison home, and he was well liked by Richard and Eleanor. He was described as polite, attentive, and utterly devoted to Sarah. When detectives went to the cafe to speak with Lucas, they found him in the middle of his morning shift, seemingly oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded on Maple Avenue. His initial reaction to the news of the murders was one of profound shock and devastation. He broke down in tears, his grief so raw and visceral that even the most cynical of detectives found it hard to doubt his sincerity. He told them that he had last seen Sarah on Friday night. He had picked her up from work, and they had gone for a late-night drive, a regular ritual for them. He said he had dropped her off at her house around 11:30 p.m. and had then gone straight home to his small apartment on the other side of town. He had spent the night alone, he claimed, and had woken up the next morning feeling uneasy when Sarah hadn't responded to his good morning text. His alibi seemed plausible, and his emotional state was consistent with that of a grieving boyfriend. But Corbin, a man who had learned to trust his instincts, felt a flicker of something unsettling in Lucas's demeanor. It was a subtle thing, a fleeting expression in his eyes, a slight hesitation in his voice when he recounted the events of the previous night. It was enough to make Corbin want to dig deeper. The initial background check on Lucas Thorne revealed a seemingly unremarkable life. He had grown up in a neighboring town, had a clean record, and had been working at the cafe for the past 2 years. His co-workers described him as a friendly and reliable colleague, if a little reserved. There was nothing in his past that suggested a capacity for such extreme violence. But as the days turned into a week, and the investigation intensified, small cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed facade of Lucas Thorne. Detectives discovered that he had a history of financial problems, with a string of unpaid debts and a recent eviction from a previous apartment. They also learned that his relationship with Sarah was not as idyllic as it had appeared. Friends of Sarah's revealed that she had recently expressed doubts about the relationship, telling them that Lucas had become increasingly possessive and controlling. Then came the first major breakthrough. A search of Lucas's apartment turned up a pair of sneakers with a faint bloodstain on the sole. The blood was a match for Richard Harrison. When confronted with this evidence, Lucas's composure finally cracked. He denied any involvement, claiming that he had been at the Harrison house a few days before the murders and must have stepped in something. But his story was weak, and his denials were becoming increasingly frantic. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, painting a picture that was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The charming cafe worker, the loving boyfriend, was not who he appeared to be. Behind the warm smiles and easygoing demeanor, there was a darkness, a simmering resentment that had finally boiled over into an act of unspeakable violence. The town of Oakhaven was in a state of shock. The murders had shattered the community's sense of security, and the revelation that the prime suspect was one of their own was almost too much to bear. The cafe where Lucas worked became a place of morbid curiosity, with people driving by to catch a glimpse of the place where a killer had served them coffee. For Detective Corbin, the case had become an obsession. He spent his days poring over evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and trying to get inside the mind of a man who could commit such a heinous crime. He knew that he was close to an arrest, but he also knew that he needed more than just a bloodstained sneaker to secure a conviction. He needed to understand the why. What could have possibly motivated a young man to murder his girlfriend's entire family in cold blood? The answer, he suspected, lay hidden in the complex web of relationships, secrets, and lies that had been woven in the quiet suburban home on Maple Avenue. And he was determined to unravel it, no matter how dark and twisted the truth might be. The first chapter of the nightmare had ended with the discovery of the crime and the identification of a suspect. But the story was far from over. The real horror, the full extent of Lucas Thorne's depravity, was yet to be revealed. And as the investigation moved into its next phase, the community of Oakhaven held its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, and praying that justice would be served for the family that had been so tragically lost. The silence on Maple Avenue had been broken by the wail of sirens, but the echoes of the crime would linger for a long, long time. The initial shock of the Harrison family murders had given way to a simmering unease in Oakhaven. The yellow police tape was gone from 12 Maple Avenue, but the house stood as a somber monument to the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. The media had descended on the town, their satellite trucks lining the streets, their reporters hungry for any scrap of information about the case. And at the center of it all was Lucas Thorne, the handsome cafe worker who was now the prime suspect in the most brutal crime the town had ever seen. Detective Corbin and his team worked tirelessly, delving into every aspect of Lucas's life, searching for the key that would unlock the motive for such a horrific act. They spoke to his family, his friends, his former teachers, and his past employers, piecing together a portrait of a young man who was far more complex and troubled than he appeared. Lucas had grown up in a lower-middle-class family in a neighboring town. His father had been a factory worker who had lost his job during a wave of downsizing, and his mother had worked a series of low-paying retail jobs to make ends meet. Lucas was an only child, and he had been doted on by his parents, who had pinned all their hopes and dreams on him. They had always told him that he was special, that he was destined for great things. But as Lucas had grown older, he had struggled to live up to their expectations. He had been an average student in high school, and he had dropped out of community college after just one semester. He had drifted from one dead-end job to another, never finding a sense of purpose or direction. The chasm between the person his parents believed him to be and the person he actually was had grown wider with each passing year, and it had filled him with a deep-seated sense of shame and resentment. When he had met Sarah Harrison, it was as if a light had been switched on in his life. Sarah was everything he was not: confident, ambitious, and from a family that was both financially and emotionally stable. He had been instantly captivated by her, and he had set out to win her over with a charm and attentiveness that was almost overwhelming. To Sarah, Lucas was a breath of fresh air. He was different from the other boys she had dated, who had all come from similar backgrounds as her own. Lucas had a certain edge to him, a hint of a darker, more complex world that she found intriguing. He was a project, a man she could save, and she had fallen for him hard and fast. The Harrisons had initially been wary of Lucas. He was not the kind of young man they had envisioned for their daughter. But Lucas had been on his best behavior, and he had quickly won them over with his polite manners and his seemingly genuine affection for Sarah. He had become a regular fixture at their family dinners, and he had even accompanied them on a family vacation the previous summer. But beneath the surface of this seemingly happy picture, a different story was unfolding. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered a pattern of controlling and manipulative behavior on Lucas's part. He had gradually isolated Sarah from her friends, discouraging her from going out without him and constantly questioning her about her whereabouts. He had become increasingly jealous and possessive, and he had started to exhibit a volatile temper that was both frightening and unpredictable. Friends of Sarah's told detectives that she had been planning to break up with Lucas. She had confided in them that she was scared of him, that she felt trapped in the relationship. She had been trying to find the right time to end things, but she had been afraid of how he would react. The motive for the murders was beginning to come into focus. It was not a crime of passion, but a crime of control. Lucas had not killed the Harrisons in a fit of rage. He had killed them because they were a threat to his carefully constructed world. He had seen Sarah slipping away from him, and he had decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. And in his twisted logic, her family had to go too. They were the ones who had given her the strength to leave him, and for that, they had to be punished. The forensic evidence was also starting to mount. In addition to the blood on his sneaker, detectives found a small, almost invisible scratch on Lucas's arm, which he had tried to cover with a bandage. DNA from under Sarah's fingernails was a match for Lucas. It was clear that she had fought for her life, that she had tried to defend herself against the man she had once loved. The most damning piece of evidence, however, came from an unlikely source. A neighbor of the Harrisons had a security camera that was pointed at the street. The footage from the night of the murders showed Lucas's car driving away from Maple Avenue at 1:15 a.m., long after he had claimed to have gone home. With the evidence against him mounting, Lucas was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community, and it brought a sense of relief to the friends and family of the Harrisons, who had been living in fear since the murders. But the arrest was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a long and arduous legal battle, a battle that would force the community to confront the dark truths that had been hidden behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect suburban home. The trial of Lucas Thorne began in the spring of the following year. The courtroom was packed every day, with a line of people waiting to get in stretching around the block. The case had captured the attention of the entire nation, and it had become a symbol of the hidden dangers that can lurk in even the most ordinary of lives. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against Lucas, from the DNA under Sarah's fingernails to the security camera footage that placed him at the scene of the crime. They painted a picture of a man who was a master manipulator, a narcissist who was incapable of accepting rejection. They argued that he had killed the Harrisons in a cold and calculated act of revenge, a final, desperate attempt to exert his control over the woman who had dared to leave him. The defense, on the other hand, tried to portray Lucas as a victim. They argued that he had been driven to a state of emotional distress by Sarah's decision to end their relationship, and that the killings had been an act of passion, not a premeditated crime. They brought in a series of expert witnesses who testified to Lucas's troubled childhood and his history of mental health issues. But the jury was not swayed. After a 6-week trial, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. Lucas Thorne was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the community of Oakhaven, but it did not erase the scars of the tragedy. The Harrison family was gone, and their loss would be felt for years to come. The house on Maple Avenue was eventually sold, but it would forever be known as the Murder House, a place where a terrible and senseless crime had been committed. For Detective Corbin, the case was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the capacity for evil that exists in the world. He had solved the case, but he had not been able to save the Harrisons, and that was a burden he would carry with him for the rest of his days. The story of the Harrison family murders was a cautionary tale, a story about the dangers of ignoring the red flags in a relationship, a story about the importance of trusting your instincts. It was a story that would be told and retold in Oakhaven for generations to come, a story that would serve as a reminder that even in the most idyllic of places, darkness can be just a heartbeat away. The guilty verdict and the life sentence handed down to Lucas Thorne brought the legal proceedings to a close, but for the community of Oakhaven, the story was far from over. The trial had laid bare the ugly truth of what had happened on that terrible night in October, but it had not provided the answers that so many were desperate for. The why of the crime, the question of how a young man could be driven to such an extreme act of violence, remained a subject of intense speculation and debate. In the aftermath of the trial, a palpable sense of grief and introspection settled over the town. The initial shock and horror had given way to a more profound and lasting sense of loss. The Harrisons had been a beloved family, and their absence was felt in every corner of the community. The local bookstore where Sarah had worked placed a small memorial in the window, with a collection of her favorite books and a photograph of her smiling face. The vintage car club that Richard had been a proud member of held a memorial procession, with a line of classic cars driving slowly past the house on Maple Avenue. The local gardening club planted a rose bush in Eleanor's honor in the town square. These small acts of remembrance were a testament to the impact that the Harrison family had had on the lives of those around them. They were a way for the community to come to terms with the senselessness of the tragedy, to find some measure of solace in their shared grief. For those who had been closest to the family, the healing process was much more difficult. Carol, the neighbor who had first discovered the crime, was haunted by what she had seen. She eventually sold her house and moved away, unable to live with the constant reminder of the horror that had unfolded next door. Sarah's friends were left to grapple with the guilt of not having done more to help her. They had seen the warning signs in her relationship with Lucas, but they had not fully understood the danger she was in. They had been young and inexperienced, and they had not known how to intervene. Her death was a brutal lesson in the realities of domestic abuse, a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The Harrison family's extended relatives were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They had lost not just one family member, but 4, and the void that was left behind was immeasurable. They struggled to understand how something so terrible could have happened, how the grandson they had welcomed into their family could have been capable of such a monstrous act. And what of Lucas Thorne? He was now a number in the state prison system, a man who would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He had shown no remorse for his crimes, and he had never offered any explanation for his actions. He remained an enigma, a puzzle that no one could fully solve. In the years that followed the murders, the town of Oakhaven slowly began to heal. The house on Maple Avenue was eventually bought by a young family who were new to the area and unaware of its tragic history. They renovated the house, and in time, the sounds of children's laughter once again filled the rooms where so much darkness had once resided. But the memory of the Harrison family would not be forgotten. Their story became a part of the town's history, a cautionary tale that was passed down from one generation to the next. It was a story that served as a reminder of the importance of community, of the need to look out for one another, and of the dangers of letting darkness take root in the heart of a town. The case of the Café worker murders, as it came to be known, also had a lasting impact on the way that domestic violence was viewed and treated in the community. The local police department implemented new training programs for its officers, and a new nonprofit organization was established to provide support and resources for victims of domestic abuse. The tragedy had brought the issue out of the shadows and into the light, and it had forced people to confront a problem that had for too long been ignored. In the end, the story of the Harrison family was a story of a great and terrible loss. It was a story of a family that had been taken too soon, of a community that had been scarred by violence, and of a young man who had been consumed by a darkness that he could not control. But it was also a story of resilience, of a community that had come together in the face of tragedy, and of the enduring power of love and memory. The Harrisons were gone, but they were not forgotten. And in the hearts and minds of those who had known and loved them, they would live on forever. The sun would continue to rise and set over the quiet streets of Oakhaven, and life would go on. But things would never be quite the same. The silence that had once hung over Maple Avenue had been broken, and in its place was a new and profound understanding of the fragility of life and of the preciousness of every moment. The scars of the tragedy would remain, but they would serve as a reminder of the family that had been lost, and of the lessons that had been learned in the wake of their senseless and tragic deaths. And in that, there was a small but not insignificant measure of hope.